My husband threw cash in my face the moment I left prison after 3 years of taking the fall for him. I must endure this humiliation to claim a $500 million inheritance and save my brother from an asylum. The deadly game begins now. My husband threw a stack of cash in my face the moment I stepped out of the gates of Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. 3 years of taking the fall for his crimes, only to be met with this blatant betrayal. I stood still, watching a $100 bill settle under the sharp heel of Isabella Thorne. Julian laughed. He wrapped his arm around my former best friend and declared I was nothing but a failed gold digger. I reached down. I picked up the money because I needed this humiliation to get close to the $500 million trust fund. If I divorced him right now, my brother would die in the psychiatric ward Julian controlled. I had to remain his legal wife for 6 more months, according to the strict in terms of the will. I stepped back. I kept my face completely expressionless, despite the crowd of Manhattan elites mocking my tattered clothes. Julian ordered me to serve the drinks. He wanted to crush the last bit of pride left in me. I took the tray. My hands did not shake. My eyes only focused on the ring on his finger. That ring was the security key for the hidden financial ledger of the Vance global empire. Julian did not know that 3 years in prison had turned me into a real predator. I glided through the room. I memorized a look of contempt, so I could collect my debt later, with interest. Isabella Thorne approached me. She held a glass of vintage red wine and deliberately poured it over my cheap shirt. The dark red liquid spread like an open wound across the gray fabric. The crowd around us burst into laughter. They called me trash and said I did not belong on the Upper East Side. Julian did not stop her. He stood there, enjoying the shame I was forced to carry. I did not cry. I only used a paper napkin to wipe the drops from my face. Isabella leaned in close. She whispered that Julian had slept in my bed for the last 3 years. She added that my brother Leo would soon be sent away with a final injection. I gripped the tray. The cold metal bit into my palms, but I kept a soft smile. I knew Julian was watching my reaction, looking for an excuse to throw me back into a cell. I did not give him the satisfaction. I bowed my head and apologized to Isabella like a common servant. This patience was the price I had to pay to unlock the legal vault my father-in-law had left behind. That $500 million would be the rope I used to hang every person in this room. Julian walked over. He grabbed my chin and forced me to look into his eyes. He said, I was a failed investment, a liability to the prestigious Vance family name. He pulled out a non-disclosure agreement and demanded I sign it in exchange for safety. If I did not sign, he would cut the funding for my brother's heart monitor. This was a direct attack on my only weakness. But he had miscalculated one move. He did not know that Marcus Sterling, the most ruthless lawyer in all of New York, had met me in secret. Marcus had helped me build a shadow financial empire called Phoenix Capital right under Julian's nose. I took the pen. My fingers brushed against the paper, but my mind was counting down. In 10 seconds, a high-priority notification would be sent to every major shareholder. I signed my name with a sharp stroke, cold and final, like a knife, ending my patience. Julian snatched the paper. He laughed, thinking he had finally captured my soul. He had no idea that signature was the trigger to sell off 10% of his own company's shares. A synchronized sound of phone alerts echoed through the grand hall of the Upper East Side mansion. The faces of the executive directors turned from joy to a deathly pale as they looked at their screens. Julian frowned. He opened his phone, and his breath suddenly stopped. The stock price of Vance Global was in a free fall because of a massive short sell order from an unknown fund. Isabella panicked. She grabbed Julian's arm, but he shoved her away, like she was nothing but garbage. He turned to look at me, his eyes full of suspicion and raw aggression, but I stood perfectly still. I took another glass of wine and casually took a sip, right in front of my pathetic husband. I told him, in a low voice, that this was just a small gift for my homecoming. Julian lunged at me. He tried to grab my neck, but 2 men in black suits stepped out from the crowd. They were not his men. They were elite security, personally sent by Marcus Sterling. Julian froze. He saw the identification tags on their chests and realized his power was beginning to crumble. The crowd of guests and began to whisper. They backed away to avoid being in the center of the explosion. Marcus Sterling entered the hall with the presence of a king inspecting a new territory. He did not look at Julian. He walked straight to me and draped his suit jacket over my shoulders. Julian grit his teeth. He roared, asking why his greatest rival was at a private family party. Marcus only smiled. He pulled out a check and threw it at Julian, exactly the way Julian had treated me at the gate. He announced that from now on, Elena Vance did not owe Julian a single penny. Julian laughed like a madman. He said I was still his legal wife, and he could lock me up in an asylum anytime. I reached into my old pocket and pulled out a sleek black memory card. This was not the ledger, but it was evidence that Julian had conspired with doctors to forge Leo's medical records. I looked at him. My eyes were as cold as ice from the North Pole, making him take a step back. I said, if he ever dared to touch me again, this entire file would be sent straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Isabella stood there, shaking, realizing her golden world was falling apart at the seams. Julian regained his composure. He smiled wickedly and reminded me of the terms in the $500 million will. He said, I had to stay in this mansion for 6 months, or I would lose every cent. He believed that in 6 months he could make me disappear forever without leaving a trace. I smiled back. I agreed to stay because I wanted to watch him lose everything, day by day. I turned and walked away, not looking back at the mess I had just created. Marcus walked beside me. He whispered that the rescue helicopter had already picked up my brother. Just as I reached the grand staircase, a loud explosion roared from the direction of Julian's garage. A thick column of black smoke rose up, covering the bright night sky of sinful New York City. Julian screamed my name in total desperation, but I did not stop. I only tightened the jacket around me. This was not the end. It was the first shot in a financial massacre. I would turn this mansion into a magnificent tomb for Julian and Isabella Thorne. A new message flashed on my phone, saying that Leo had been successfully rescued from the ward. I walked up the stairs, feeling the weight of the mansion pressing down on me like a golden cage. Every step felt like a victory over the man who thought he could own me. Julian's voice was fading behind the sound of the fire alarms and the panic of the rich. I entered my old room. The air was stale, and the furniture was covered in white sheets. It looked like a graveyard of the woman I used to be. I tore the sheet off the mirror and looked at the stranger, staring back at me. My eyes were hard, my skin was pale, and my heart was a stone. I took off the ruined shirt and threw it into the fireplace. I watched the red wine stains curl and turn to ash in the growing flames. I was no longer the girl who went to prison for love. I was the architect of a ruin that would swallow the entire Vance name. I opened the window. The cool New York air hit my face, smelling of smoke and expensive perfume. I knew Julian would come for me tonight. His pride would not let him sleep in peace. I sat down in the dark and waited for the sound of his footsteps. The door burst open, and Julian stood there, his face red with fury, and his breathing heavy. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his eyes scanning the room for the memory card. He demanded to know where I had hidden the evidence. I did not move. I stayed in the shadows, letting the moonlight hit only my hands. I told him that the evidence was already in a secure vault outside the city. He lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat. But he stopped when he saw the small device in my hand. It was a remote connected to the gas lines of the guest house where Isabella was currently staying. I told him to stay back, or I would. Finish what? The garage fire started. He froze, his eyes darting between my face and the button. He realized, for the first time, that I was truly capable of killing him. He backed away, his hands trembling with a mix of rage and fear. I told him to go back to his mistress and tell her to prepare for a long winter. He left the room, his footsteps heavy with defeat, leaving me alone with my ghosts. I looked out at the skyline and whispered my brother's name. The night was long, but I did not close all my eyes for a second. I spent the hours watching the stock market on my laptop, watching the numbers tick down. By dawn, Julian Vance had lost over $200 million in market value. He would be forced to call an emergency meeting of the board by 9 a.m. I dressed in a sharp black suit that Marcus had sent to the back door. I looked like a widow going to a funeral, but it was Julian's, not mine. I walked down to the dining room where Isabella was crying over a burnt breakfast. She looked at me, her eyes full of hatred, and called me a monster. I ignored her. I poured to myself a cup of black coffee and sat at the head of the table. Julian walked in. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a single night. He sat down across from me, his hands shaking as he held the morning paper. He did not speak a word. He just stared at the headline about the Vance Global crash. I took a sip of my coffee and told him that the board was waiting for his explanation. Julian stood up. He knocked his chair over and walked out without looking back. Isabella followed him, screaming about her lost social standing and her ruined reputation. I was alone in the silence of the mansion, listening to the clock on the wall. Every tick was a second closer to the 6-month deadline. I knew this was just the beginning of his counterattack. Julian Vance was not a man who surrendered. He was a man who burned everything down before he lost. I checked the security cameras on my phone, making sure Leo was safe in Marcus's penthouse. My brother was the only reason I was still breathing. I would protect him at any cost, even if I had to burn the entire city to the ground. I felt the vibration of my phone It was a message from an unknown number. It contained a photo of Marcus Sterling standing at a window with a red dot on his chest. My heart stopped for a beat, but I did not let out a sound. Julian was playing his last card, a hitman. I stood up. I smashed the coffee cup on the marble floor, the porcelain shattering into brie, 1,000 white pieces. I did not call the police. I did not call Marcus, because I knew the lines were being monitored. I had to move fast, and I had to move alone. I grabbed my coat and headed for the back exit through the kitchen. I saw Julian's chief of security standing by the gate, his hand on his holster. I did not stop. I walked straight toward him and handed him an envelope. Inside was a check for $1 million and a photo of his daughter at school. I told him that he had two choices. He could be a hero, or he could be a rich man. He looked at the check. Then he looked at the photo, and his hand dropped from the gun. He opened the gate and let me through, without saying a single word. I ran to the parked black sedan and sped toward the city. The chase was on, and the stakes were no longer just about money. It was about the life of the only man who had helped me survive. I am racing through Manhattan at 90 miles per hour to save the only man who helped me survive prison. Julian sent a hitman to kill Marcus because I broke his financial empire. If I am late by 1 second, I lose everything, including my brother, Leo. I slammed the accelerator of the black sedan, weaving through the heavy traffic of Midtown Manhattan. The photo of Marcus, with that lethal red dot on his chest, was taped to the dashboard. My heart was a hammer against my ribs, but my hands were steady on the wheel. Behind me, 2 black SUVs with tinted windows surged through the lanes, ignoring every traffic light. Julian did not just want Marcus dead. He wanted me to watch it happen from the rearview mirror. I checked my watch. I had exactly 4 minutes before Marcus walked onto his balcony for his morning cigar. That was the window the assassin was waiting for, and Julian knew it. I shifted gears. The engine roared, a mechanical beast, screaming for blood and vengeance. I grabbed the burner phone Marcus had given me and dialed a coded emergency number. I did not speak. I only pressed the number 4 twice to signal a level 4 security breach. The SUVs rammed into my bumper, the sound of grinding metal echoing through the narrow concrete canyons. I did not brake. I steered into the hit, using the momentum to spin the lead car into a parked delivery truck. A massive crash of glass and steel followed me, As I tore onto Fifth Avenue, I reached the Sterling building, but the main entrance was blocked by a fake construction crew. Julian was thorough. He had closed the streets to ensure no help could arrive. I did not slow down. I drove the sedan straight through the plastic barriers and toward the free underground parking ramp. My tires screamed against the concrete as I spiraled down to the private elevator. I checked the live feed from Marcus's penthouse on my phone. The red dot was now centered on the glass door. The assassin was not in this building. He was on the roof of the hotel across the street. I redirected my path. I drove out of the parking exit and sped toward the Plaza Hotel. I ignored the shouting doorman and drove the car onto the sidewalk, stopping inches from the revolving doors. I jumped out, the engine still smoking from the high-speed pursuit, and ran for the stairs. I knew the service elevator was faster, but Julian's men would be waiting for the lift to open. I climbed the stairs, 4 at a time, my lungs burning with every breath of stale air. I reached the roof. The door was heavy, but the bribe I paid the chief of security earlier meant the lock was already sabotaged. I pushed the door open. The wind from the heights whipped my hair across my face. I saw him, a man in a gray tactical suit, lying prone, with a long-range sniper rifle. He was focused. His finger was tightening on the trigger, and Marcus was just stepping out into the sun. I did not shout. I did not waste time with words. I simply picked up a heavy metal pipe from the roof. I swung it with every bit of rage I had saved up. For 3 years, the pipe connected with the rifle barrel, just as the muzzle flashed with a deadly light. The bullet went wide, shattering a decorative stone gargoyle on the Sterling building instead of Marcus's skull. The assassin hissed. He tried to draw a sidearm, but I was already on top of him. I grabbed his wrist and twisted, the bone snapping with a dry toe, sickening sound. I kicked the handgun across the gravel roof and pinned him down with my knee on his throat. I reached for his comms unit and spoke into the open channel to let Julian hear my voice. I told him that his best in Hunter was now my prisoner, and his prize was safe. Marcus appeared on the balcony. He looked across the gap and saw me standing on the edge. He did not panic. He simply raised his glass in a silent toast to his savior. I looked down at the assassin. His eyes were wide with the realization that a woman had just ended his career. I did not feel pity. I felt only a cold, mechanical satisfaction that the first trap had been sprung. I reached into the man's tactical vest and pulled out a tablet, displaying the contract. It was signed with a digital signature that traced back to a Deus shell company owned by Isabella Thorne. Julian was clever. He used his mistress's name to keep his own hands clean, but he was still the architect. I photographed the screen, my thumb clicking the camera button like a heartbeat of a new legal war. I heard the sirens approaching, but they were not for me. They were for the man under my boot. Marcus's own security team swarmed the roof, taking the hitman from my hands with professional efficiency. I stood up, smoothing my suit, jacket, and looked toward the Vance mansion. In the distance, I took the service elevator down, the silence of the small car, a contrast to the chaos. Marcus was waiting in the lobby. His face was a mask of calm authority, but his eyes were burning with a dark intensity. He walked to me, his hand resting on the brain, small of my back, a gesture of protection and partnership. He told me that Julian had just committed the biggest mistake of his entire life by missing. I handed him the tablet and told him about the Isabella connection and the garage fire evidence. Marcus smiled, a thin, dangerous line, and said it was time to move to phase 2 of the liquidation. We walked out to his armored limousine, the crowd of onlookers parting like the Red Sea before his power. I checked my phone. A notification from the board of directors arrived. They were calling for an immediate vote of no confidence against Julian Vance within the next 48 hours. The red dot was no longer on Marcus. It was moving toward Julian's own forehead in a different kind of way. We pulled away, the city lights blurring into a stream of neon and shadow. Just as the car reached the bridge, a massive digital billboard flickered and changed its colorful display. Instead of a perfume ad, it showed the security footage of Julian throwing the money at me yesterday. Above the video, in giant white letters, it read, "The true face of Vance Global." Marcus had not just saved me. He had turned the entire city into a weapon against my pathetic former husband. I looked at the screen, and I felt a surge of dopamine hitting my brain like a drug. People on the cracks street were stopping, taking pictures, and posting the shame of the billionaire king. I turned to Marcus and asked him what the next step of the game was going to be today. He leaned in, his voice a low rumble. Against the sound of the luxury car's engine, he said that by midnight, Julian would be begging us to take the company to save himself. I felt a vibration in the car's floorboards. Then a loud metallic thud hit the roof. A magnetic device was clinging to the armored ceiling, its red light blinking with a rapid and deadly rhythmic frequency. Marcus grabbed me and pulled me to the floor as the car began to accelerate. I am trapped in a metal coffin with a timer counting down to 0. Julian wants me dead before I reach the board meeting. My only weapon is a hairpin and a 3-year prison sentence of learning to dismantle locks. The red light of the magnetic bomb flickered against the sunroof's glass, like a dying heart. 10 seconds. Left on the rise. Digital timer echoed in the silence of the armored cabin. I reached into my hair and pulled out a heavy steel pin I had sharpened in my cell. Marcus grabbed the door handle, but I shouted for him to stay down. I knew the magnetic lock of the car would interfere with the bomb sensor. If I reversed the polarity, I slammed my shoulder against the P's emergency panel under the armrest and ripped out the wires. Sparks flew, stinging my skin, but I ignored the burning smell of ozone. I touched the positive lead to the chassis, creating a sudden surge of energy to repel the magnet. The device shifted with a metallic scrape and slid toward the trunk. I told the driver to hit the brakes. Now, the car jerked backward at 60 miles per hour, throwing the bomb off the roof and onto the asphalt. A roar of white flame consumed the street behind us, shattering the rear window of the limousine. We rolled out of the car as it skidded to a halt near the East River Bridge. My suit was dusty, but my mind was sharper than a razor blade. Julian had tried to incinerate me on the way to the meeting, which meant he was truly terrified of what I carried. I checked the time on Marcus's gold watch. We had 5 minutes before the board vote began. I told Marcus to call the media and tell them there was a terrorist attack on a Vance Global vehicle. We did not wait for the police. We hopped onto a black motorcycle Marcus kept in a nearby garage. I clung to his waist as we wove through the smoke and sirens of the city. We arrived at the Vance Tower, the glass building, shining like a tomb under the morning sun. The lobby was crawling with Julian's private security, their hands resting on their holsters like hungry wolves I did not hide. I walked straight to the center elevator and pressed the floor for the executive boardroom. Julian thought he was the king of this tower, but he was about to find out he was just a tenant. The elevator opened on the 60th floor, and the sound of Julian's voice boomed through the mahogany doors. He was telling the board that I was mentally unstable and had been involved in a fatal car accident. He was claiming that Marcus Sterling was using me to destroy the now company's value for a hostile takeover. I pushed the doors open, the heavy wood swinging back with a loud thud against the walls. The room went silent. 50 eyes staring at my dusty suit and the blood on my knuckles. Julian froze, his hand mid-air, his face turning a shade of gray I had only seen on corpses. Isabella sat next to him, her fingers trembling as she tried to hide her phone under the table. I walked to the head of the table and threw the charred remains of the magnetic bomb onto the polished surface. I told the board members that their CEO had just tried to murder his wife and his primary creditor on Broadway. The air in the room became heavy with the smell of a scandal that no amount of money could ever wash away. Julian tried to call security, but Marcus stepped too forward with a stack of legal documents in his hand. He announced that he was representing the majority of the debt holders, who were now demanding immediate repayment. If Julian could not produce $200 million by noon, the company would enter involuntary bankruptcy. Isabella tried to speak, but I turned my gaze on to her and played the audio recording of her hiring the hitman. Her voice filled the room, cold and calculating, as she discussed the price for Marcus's life. The board members looked at her with a mix of disgust and horror, realizing they were sitting next to a killer. I looked at Julian's finger. The silver ring was still there, glowing under the fluorescent lights. I told him to take it off and hand it over as collateral for the debt he owed me. He laughed, a high-pitched, desperate sound, and said I would never touch the ledger as long as he was breathing. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small remote for the medical equipment in Leo's room. He told me that if I did not walk out of this room and sign over my inheritance, he would stop the oxygen flow to my brother. The room gasped Even the most hardened directors were shocked by his blatant cruelty and lack of soul. I took a step forward, my face inches from his, and I did not blink. I told him that he was a fool to. I think I would come here without securing my heart's only treasure. I pulled out my own phone and showed him a live video of Leo eating breakfast in $1 safe house. Marcus had moved him an hour ago, using a decoy ambulance to fool Julian's men. The remote in Julian's hand was now nothing more than a piece of useless plastic and cheap electronics. I grabbed his hand and twisted his to finger until the silver ring slid off his skin and into my palm. He roared in pain, but nobody in the room moved to help him. They only watched. I turned to ask the board and asked for a breast vote on his immediate removal from the position of Chief Executive Officer. Every hand in the room went up, except for Isabella's, which was busy being cuffed by the police. Julian was dragged out of the room, his heels scraping against the carpet like a trapped animal. He was screaming that he would find a way to destroy me from behind bars. I did not listen. I sat in his chair and placed the ring into the slot of the master computer. The screen flickered, and the true financial history of Vance Global began to scroll in long lines of red and green. I saw the names of politicians and judges who had been bought by Julian's father years ago. This was not just a company. It was a parasite feeding on the city of New York itself. I looked at Marcus, and he nodded, knowing that the next phase of the plan would involve a total rebuild of the system. A sudden alert flashed on the screen. A hidden protocol called the asylum trap was activated. It was a legal order signed by Julian a year ago, declaring me mentally unfit to hold any corporate power. Even if he was in jail, his lawyers would use this to lock me away in a private sanatorium by tonight. The door opened, and a man in a white coat stood there, with 2 armed orderlies. I looked at the man in the white coat. His eyes were cold and empty, like a machine. He held a leather folder with the official seal of the state medical board. He told me that according to the document in his hand, I was a danger to myself and others, and must be taken into custody. Marcus tried to block the door, but the 2 orderlies were massive, their muscles straining against their white uniforms. They were not Medical staff, they were free. Mercenaries hired to enforce Julian's final poison pill. Julian's lawyer, a man with a face like a rat, stepped into the room and smiled at me. He said that the board vote was invalid because a person declared incompetent could not hold any legal authority. Julian had planned for his own downfall, and he had built a cage that would to lock from the inside. I stood up, feeling the cold silver ring in my hand, and I realized that the ledger was not my only weapon. I had the bank codes for the Sterling Trust and the evidence of the rat lawyer's money laundering. I looked at the mercenary and told him to check a bank account before he touched me. He paused, his hand hovering near my arm, and he pulled out his call phone with a confused look. I had just transferred $50,000 into his account with a single click on my tablet. I told him that there was another $50,000 waiting for him if he walked out of this building right now. The other orderly looked at his partner, and they both nodded, turning their backs on the rat lawyer and his folder. The man in the white coat started to shout, but Marcus grabbed in him by the collar and threw him into the hallway. The board members were now standing, their faces full of shock as they realized how deep the corruption went. I sat back in the CEO chair, and I told the rat, a lawyer, that his license would be revoked by sunset. He turned pale and ran out of the room, leaving the legal papers on the canapé floor like dead leaves. I looked at Marcus, and I told him to call the judge and get the emergency injunction signed. The war for Vance Global was finally over, but the war for New York was just beginning. I opened the master file on the screen, and I saw the list of every property Julian owned. There was a hidden villa in the Swiss Alps and a private island in the Caribbean. He had stolen billions of dollars from the company's pension funds and the city's tax revenue. I felt a surge of rage, but I kept my voice steady, and I told Marcus to start the liquidation process. Every dollar would be returned to the people Julian had cheated over the last 10 years. The board directors began to clap, but I silenced them with a single look of pure contempt. They were just as guilty as Julian for letting him rule like a tyrant for so long. I told them that they were all fired effective immediately, and that a new board would be appointed by Marcus. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city I had finally reclaimed. I could see the lights of the penthouse where Leo was safe, and for the first time in 3 years, I could finally breathe. The shadow of the prison was gone, and the Fuan Hoang had truly risen from the ash. I am staring at my father's name on a digital hit list, while the most powerful man in New York threatens to erase me from existence. The Black Ledger is not just a record of greed. It is a graveyard of the innocent. And Julian's father was the gravedigger. I will use these secrets to burn the city's elite until there is nothing left but ash. The cursor blinked. A steady white pulse. Against the name of Thomas Vance. My father. June 12th, 2022. The date of the fatal crash was listed next to a single word. Liquidated. A payment of $2 million had been transferred to a shell company on the same day my world had ended. I felt a cold, jagged edge of rage slicing through my veins, replacing the blood with pure venom. My father did not die in a tragic accident. He was murdered because he discovered the truth about the Vance family's illegal oil contracts in the Middle East. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk until my knuckles turned white as bone, and the silver ring bit into my palm. A sharp electronic tone cut through the silence of the penthouse office as the private line began to vibrate. I did not hesitate. I pressed the speaker button and waited for the voice of the man who thought he could still control me. It was Governor Anthony Whitmore, the golden boy of the New York political machine, and the third name on the Black Ledger's list of beneficiaries. His voice was a low and calculated rumble, sounding like expensive silk rubbing against a blade. He told me that I was holding a live grenade, and that I should be very careful about where I chose to drop it. He said that New York was a city of legends, but it was also a city where troublesome people disappeared into the concrete of the Fay Hudson River. I did not respond with fear. I simply leaned back in the CEO chair and watched the data scroll past his name. I told him that his career was built on $500,000 of stolen pension funds and 3 counts of suppressed evidence. The line went silent for 5 long seconds as the weight of my words began to choke his confidence. He laughed, a dry and brittle sound that carried no humor, and he told to me that no judge would ever accept data stolen by a convicted felon like myself. He reminded me that the asylum order was still being processed and that he could have me committed by midnight. I felt the pressure of his power pressing down on my chest, but I had already built my own fortress. I told the governor that he should check the private server of the New York Times in exactly 10 minutes. I had already set an automated upload protocol that would release his bank records to every major news outlet if my heart rate exceeded 100 beats per I mine it. This was the psychological anchor I had forged in my cell, a system of mutually assured destruction. If I died or was locked away, his entire legacy would become a public execution of his character. I heard him gasp, a sharp intake of air that whistled through his teeth as he realized he was no longer the predator. I demanded that he call the district attorney and ensure that Julian was held without bail in a high-security block of Rikers Island. I also told him to sign the executive order for a full audit of the Vance Estates charitable foundations immediately. He started to protest, but I cut him off with a sentence about his daughter's illegal Ivy League admission. He hung up the phone without another word, the sound of the disconnect echoing like a final nail in his coffin. Marcus Sterling walked into the office, his suit perfectly pressed, but his eyes showing the fatigue of a long night. He looked at the screen and saw the red highlighted names of the men I was about to destroy. He asked me if I was ready for the backlash that was coming from the shadows. I told him that I had been living in the shadows for 3 years, and that I was finally bringing the light of justice. Marcus handed me a leather folder containing the final signatures for the $500 million inheritance transfer. All I needed was to spend one night in the Vance family estate at the Hamptons, as per the final clause of the Dichuk. It was a trap, a house designed to kill me, but it was also the only place where my father's original journals were hidden. Julian had moved Isabella there, under house arrest, thinking he could use her as bait to lure me into a final confrontation tonight. I stood up and straightened my black blazer, the weight of the silver ring feeling like a weapon in my hand. We arrived at the Hamptons estate just as the sun began to dip below the Atlantic horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood. The mansion was a sprawling white beast of glass and stone, standing lonely on the cliffs. Julian's private security was gone, replaced by a team of federal marshals who were monitoring Isabella. I walked through the front doors, the scent of sea salt and expensive lilies filling my lungs with a familiar sense of dread. I saw Isabella sitting by the infinity pool, her face pale and her eyes sunken into her skull from fear. She looked at me, and her lips trembled as she tried to find a lie that could save her soul. I ignored her and headed for the library, the place where my father had spent his last night alive. I knew the journals were not in a safe. They were hidden inside the hollowed-out spine of the family Bible on the pedestal. I reached for the book, but a cold, metallic click behind my head stopped my hand. It was not a Marshall. It was Julian's younger brother, Silas, who had been hiding in the shadows of the rounded gallery above. He was the quiet one, the one everyone ignored, but the black ledger listed him as the family's true cleaner. He told me that Julian was a fool for trying to bribe me when he should have just ended me at the gate. He demanded the silver ring, claiming it was the only thing that could unlock the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I felt the cold barrel of the suppressed pistol pressing against the back of my skull, but I did not move a muscle. I told Silas that the ring was biometric, and that if he killed me, the accounts would be locked forever. This was the logic of the cage. I had become the only person who could access the stolen billions of net, the Vance family empire. Silas hesitated, his breathing becoming a ragged sound as he weighed the risk of pulling the trigger against the greed. I slowly turned around, facing the gun, and I saw the sweat beaded on his forehead. I told him that his brother had already betrayed him by naming Silas as the primary suspect in the oil contract murders. I showed him a forged document on my phone, a fake confession Julian had supposedly signed in exchange for a reduced sentence tonight. Silas's eyes went wide, and his hand began to shake with the realization of his brother's treachery. This was the betrayal cascade, the moment where the family of Relater snakes began to eat as their own tails for survival. He lowered the gun, his mind spinning with the thought of Julian's betrayal, and I took the opportunity to disarm him with a swift strike to his wrist. The gun fell to the marble floor, the sound of the impact echoing through the silent and empty library. I picked up a weapon and told him to get out of my house before I decided to test the limits of my own mercy. He ran out the back doors, a broken man fleeing into the darkness of the dunes like a rat. I turned back to the Bible and pulled out my father's journal, the leather cover feeling warm in my hands. I opened it to the last page and saw a handwritten note addressed to me, dated the day he died. It said, "Elena, the ring is the key, but your heart is the lock. Do not let them turn you into one of them." I felt a tear finally break free and roll down my cheek, landing on the ink of his final words. I realized that the $500 million was not a prize. It was a responsibility to fix what they had broken. A sudden sound of helicopter blades cutting through the air outside made me look toward the ocean and the beach. It was not Marcus. It was a team of blacked-out tactical birds landing on my lawn without any lights. Julian had used his last legal loophole to launch a private military strike on his own home to recover a ledger. I stood in the center of the library, holding the journal and the gun, as the first window shattered in a shower of glass. I ran for the hidden wine cellar, the only part of the house that was reinforced with 3-inch steel. I knew the layout of the tunnels because my father had designed them as a failsafe. Years ago, I reached the heavy iron door and slammed it shut, sliding the bolt home just as the tactical team entered the main hall. I pulled up the security feed on my and watched them move through the house with professional and deadly precision. They were not here to arrest me. They were here to erase every piece of evidence, including my own physical body tonight. I reached for the emergency detonator my father had installed in the foundations of the mansion decades ago. If I could not have my home, Julian would not have his legacy. I would blow the entire estate into the Atlantic Ocean. I looked at the timer. 30 seconds remained before the first breaching charge hit the cellar door. I closed my eyes, and I thought of Leo's face and the justice I had finally won for our father. The floor began to shake with the force of the first explosion. Above my head now, I am surfacing from the freezing depths of the Atlantic while the Vance estate burns like a funeral pyre on the cliffs above me. I have exactly 10 minutes to broadcast the truth to the world before the Council of 12 erases me from history forever. The steel door groaned, a hydraulic ram, screaming against the hinges of the wide cellar. I had exactly 10 seconds before the strike team entered the room. I looked at the detonator in my hand, a small black box that held the end of the Vance legacy. I pressed the red button, and the floor began to vibrate with a low and primal rumble. I did not wait for the fire. I dove into the narrow maintenance shaft behind the rests, wine racks, a massive roar of orange light and heat consumed the cellar just as I slid into the darkness of the pipes. The explosion was a physical wall of sound that pushed me deeper into the earth. I crawled through the damp concrete tunnel, my skin scraping against the rough walls while the world above me turned into ash. I could hear the mansion collapsing, millions of dollars in glass and stone falling into the hungry Atlantic, waves below the cliffside. I reached the end of the pipe, and I plunged into the freezing salt water of the bay. The strike team was using a thermal charge to melt the steel locking mechanism of the vault door. I knew the structural integrity of the Hamptons estate was compromised. A moment the first charge went off. In the hall. I had wired the gas lines to the primary of foundation pillars to ensure a total and irreversible collapse. I was not just destroying a house. I was erasing the base of Julian's operations. I slid into the drainage pipe, feeling the rush of cold air from the ocean, pulling at my soaked clothing now. The cold was a jagged knife, cutting through a wetsuit and stealing the breath from my lungs. I kicked toward the surface, seeing the flickering reflection of the burning estate on the waves above me. I broke the surface, and I gulped in the air, which tasted of smoke and expensive cedar wood fire. The mansion was a crown of flames on the reeds, dark cliff, a funeral pyre for the secrets of the Vance family. I saw the silhouettes of two black speedboats cutting through the water toward my position. They had heat sensors, and I knew I was still alive in the dark ocean. I began to swim toward the sick, rocky outcrop where my father had hidden a small emergency beacon years ago. The sound of the boat engines was a rapid and deadly drumbeat, getting closer with every second of my struggle. I felt a sudden spray of water near my head as the first round of suppressed fire hit the sea around me now. I dove under the water, letting the dark currents hide my body from the infrared eyes of the hunters. I could feel the vibration of the propellers passing directly above my head, a mechanical monster searching for its prey. I reached the underwater cave, and I pulled myself up onto a slippery shelf of rock. My fingers were numb, and my vision was blurring, but I reached for the satellite transmitter in my waterproof pouch. I activated the global broadcast signal, a hack Marcus had prepared for this exact moment of desperation. The boats turned around, their spotlights scanning the cave entrance like hungry yellow eyes in the night. I heard a voice over a megaphone telling me that there was no escape from the reaches of the Vance estate. I did not answer. I simply waited for the connection to be established with the world's media servers. My father's journal was safe in a dry bag, strapped to my chest like a second heart. A blinding white light suddenly cut through the darkness of the bay from the east. It was not a spotlight from the speedboats. It was the high-intensity beam of a coast guard cutter. The sound of a heavy machine gun echoed across the water, As the federal authorities engaged Julian's private mercenaries in a fierce and final battle, Marcus's voice boomed over the radio, telling the tactical team to stand down or be destroyed by the legal might of the United States. I saw a fast response boat peeling off from the cutter and heading toward the cave, with Marcus standing at the bow. He looked like a god of justice rising from the foam of the sea to claim his queen. I stepped out onto the ledge, the light of the burning mansion illuminating my face like a phoenix. The speedboats tried to flee, but they were boxed in by the massive power of the naval blockade now. Marcus grabbed my hand and pulled me onto the deck of the rescue boat, his eyes full of relief. I did not stop to rest. I grabbed the waterproof camera and linked it to the satellite uplink. I told Marcus to open the channel to every major network in New York and Washington immediately. The screen on my tablet flickered, and I saw the logos of the BBC and CNN and Fox appearing in the corner. I looked into the lens, my face covered in soot and salt, but my eyes were burning with a cold and lethal fire. I began to speak, my voice steady and clear, carrying across the entire world through the silent airwaves. I announced that I was Elena Vance, the woman the city had tried to bury in a prison for 3 years. I told the world about the Black Ledger and the governor's role in the murder of my father. I held up my father's journal, and I showed the pages detailing the illegal contracts and the assassinations. The image of the burning mansion behind me provided the perfect backdrop for the end of an era. I told the people of New York that the Vance family empire was officially dead, and that the recovery had begun. I saw the chalk on the redder news anchors' faces as they realized the magnitude of the scandal I was exposing. A sudden alert appeared on the screen, a message from the governor's private office in Albany. He was resigning, effective immediately, but he had also issued a warrant for my arrest for national security violations. I looked at Marcus, and he smiled, knowing that the game was just moving to the Supreme Court. A dark shadow appeared on the sonar. A submarine was surfacing directly under our boat. The submarine was not a naval vessel. It was a private craft, marked with a symbol of the Council of 12. This was a group that Julian's father had feared, the real masters of the global energy markets in London and Dubai. They were here to recover the ledger before the information could be fully decrypted by the federal government. I realized that the war was no longer about the Vance name, but about the energy future of the Western world. Marcus grabbed his weapon and told me to get behind the armored cabin of the response boat immediately. A hatch opened on the deck of the submarine, and a man in a white tuxedo stepped out. He held a phone and said that my brother, Leo, was no longer at the penthouse in Manhattan. He had been taken to a neutral location in Switzerland to ensure my cooperation with the council's demands. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me, but I did not let my hands tremble. I told the man that if Leo was not returned in 24 hours, the decryption keys for the ledger would be sent to the United Nations. He smiled, a thin and bloodless line, and said that the council did not negotiate with common thieves. He raised his hand, and a swarm of small black drones rose from the submarine, circling our boat like a halo of death. I looked at the tablet, and I realized that the true power of the ledger was not the secrets it held, but the codes it protected. I had to make a choice between the world's justice and my brother's life now. The drones began to emit a high-pitched whine, preparing for a synchronized strike on our engine block. I am standing on a jet above the Atlantic, carrying a fake drive to fool the council while my brother is held in a mountain vault. Julian is in a cage, but Marcus is the one holding my leash, and I am about to find out his hands are covered in my father's blood. The drones circled, a halo of black metal, humming with the promise of a synchronized strike against our boat. I looked at the man in the white tuxedo. His eyes were cold, like the depth of the ocean under us. I held up the small silver thumb drive, and I told him it contained the master wipe command for the entire Black Ledger. I said that if a single drone fired, the energy market codes for 3 continents would be erased. Within 1 second, the man paused, his hand midair, as he weighed the loss of billions against my small life. He signaled the swarm to retreat, and he told me that the Council of 12 was waiting for me in Zurich. Marcus moved beside me, his hand resting on his sidearm, his face a mask of calm fury. We boarded the private jet, waiting on the deck of the submarine, the engines roaring with a hungry sound for the sky. I sat in the leather seat, feeling the weight of the silver ring against my skin, like a brand. Marcus poured 2 glasses of expensive scotch, and he told me that Leo would be safe by the time we landed in Switzerland. I did not drink. I only watched the clouds below us, thinking of the fire that had consumed my home in the Hamptons. Julian was a ghost, in a cell, but the men we were meeting now were the gods who built his world of greed and oil. We landed at the private terminal in Zurich, where the air was thin and tasted of snow and old money. The Alps were white, teeth biting into the gray sky, surrounding the city like a fortress. A fleet of black, armored sedans was waiting, their engines idling with a low and rhythmic vibration on the tarmac. Marcus took my hand. His grip was firm, and he told me to trust him, no matter what happened. Inside the glass tower, we drove through the silent streets, past the banks that held the secrets of the world's elite. The headquarters of the council was a monolith of glass and steel, standing over the lake like a silent watchman. We entered the lobby, where the security was. Not men in suits, but automated systems, scanning our retinas and our very heartbeats. I felt the pressure of the building, a physical weight on my chest as we ascended to the top. Floor in a glass elevator. The city shrank below us, a toy box of lights and shadows, and I realized that I was entering a heart of the machine. The doors opened into a circular room where 12 men sat behind a table made of a single piece of black volcanic rock. The leader, a man named Henderson, did not look up from his tablet. He only told me to place the ring on the central sensor. I did not move. I stood in the center of the room, and I demanded to see my brother, Leo, before I gave them a single bit of data. Henderson smiled, a thin and bloodless line, and he signaled for a screen to descend from the ceiling. I saw Leo. He was sitting in a white room, playing with a set of wooden blocks, unaware of the war, raging for his soul. My heart ached, a sharp and jagged pain, but I kept my face as cold as the mountains outside. I told Henderson that the ring was protected by a biometric lock that required my pulse to remain under 90. If they tried to take it by force, the ledger would self-destruct, and their oil empires would crumble into a heap of useless paper. The men at the table whispered, their voices like dry leaves rubbing together in a dark forest. Henderson agreed to a private deliberation, and he signaled for Marcus and to me to wait in the glass office next to the main chamber. I walked into the office. The silence of the room was a heavy shroud, and I felt the urge to scream against the glass. Marcus sat on the edge of the desk, his eyes fixed on the door, his body coiled like a spring, ready to snap. I looked at Marcus, and I asked him why the council had chosen him to be my shadow for 3 Long years in prison. He did not answer. He only looked at his watch. And he told me that we were running out of time to save Leo. I felt a surge of suspicion, a cold snake of doubt crawling up my spine, and I moved. I grabbed the laptop sitting on the desk, and I used the silver ring to bypass the security protocols of the council's local network. I was not looking for the energy codes. I was looking for the incident report from June 12th, 2022. I found a hidden folder protected by a level 7 encryption that matched the signature of Marcus's legal firm. I felt my breath hitch, a sharp catch in my throat as the first file began to open on the screen. It was a surveillance log detailing every movement of my father for 1 month before the fatal car crash. Every entry was signed by Marcus Sterling, the man who claimed to be my savior and my father's friend. I saw a photo of my father leaving his office, and the timestamp was exactly 1 hour before the accident happened. There was a note attached to the file telling the cleaning crew that the target was moving and the road was clear for the strike. My vision blurred, the room spinning in a vortex of gray and file white, as I realized the depth of the betrayal I was living. Marcus was not my ally. He was the architect of my father's death, and he had been using me to find the ledger he had lost 3 years ago. I stood up, my hand trembling as I reached for the concealed pistol in my waistband. But Marcus was faster, his hand on my wrist before I could draw the weapon. He did not look guilty. He only looked tired, his eyes reflecting the same cold logic that had killed my family and my soul. He told me that I did not understand the complexity of the game we were playing, and that my father was a necessary sacrifice. He said that the Vance family was just a distraction, a shield for the council to hide their true intentions from the world's energy markets. I spat in his face, the warmth of my rage hitting his peace, cold skin, and I told him that he was a monster who deserved to rot in the hell he built. He did not flinch. He only wiped his face with a silk handkerchief and told me that the deal was already done with Henderson. The door opened, and Henderson entered the Dodd room with 2 armed guards, their rifles aimed at my chest with a steady and lethal intent. He told me that Marcus had already transferred the primary decryption keys during the flight from New York to Zurich. The ring I held was now nothing more than a piece of expensive jewelry, a toy for a girl who I thought she was a player on this board. I felt the weight of my failure, a crushing and absolute darkness pressing down on my soul like the The walls of my cell. Marcus stood beside Henderson, his position clear. His role as the council's enforcer finally revealed in the light of the Swiss morning sun today. I was a liability, a piece of damaged goods that needed to be liquidated before the tenanted news cycle moved on to the next scandal. I looked at the counter glass wall, and I realized that the only way out was down into the frozen lake, 1,000 feet below. I did not wait for the guards to fire. I grabbed the heavy crystal award from the desk and threw it at the window. The glass shattered into a million diamonds. A beautiful and deadly rain falling into the void of the Swiss Alps. I dove through the jagged opening, the wind, a scream of ice in my ears as I fell toward the dark water of Lake Zurich below the tower. I saw Marcus lean over the edge, his face a mask of two, something that looked like regret, but I did not care for his pity anymore. I hit the water, the impact a physical blow that nearly knocked the consciousness from my broken and cold body. I sank into the black depths, the silence of the lake, a welcome relief from the noise of the war. Above the surface now, I kicked toward the bottom, where the drainage pipes of the city were hidden under the silt and the mud. I was not dead. I was a ghost. Again. A predator who had lost everything but the will to kill. Every man in that glass and steel tower. I reached the pipe, and I pulled myself inside, the darkness swallowing me whole as I began the long crawl back to the light. I still had the physical journal of my father, the one thing Marcus had forgotten to take from my chest. Inside the back cover was a microchip that held the true codes, the ones that could turn the entire energy grid into a weapon. I surfaced in a cold alleyway, miles from the council's headquarters, my clothes shredded and my skin blue from the ice of the lake. I did not go to a hotel. I went to a small underground cafe where the hackers of Zurich gathered to trade secrets for coins. I needed a secure line, and I needed a way to reach Julian Vance in his cell in Rikers. He was the only one left who knew the council's secret vault, the place where they kept the physical gold that backed their digital energy empire in Switzerland. I sat in the corner, my hands shaking, as I typed the first lines of a code that would begin the final meltdown of sterling legal in the Council of 12 tonight. I realized that Marcus had not just killed my father. He had stolen my life. And I was going to take it back with interest and blood and fire. A news broadcast on the wall showed the tower I had just escaped, with smoke rising from the top, a floor where the bomb I had left behind was finally going off. Marcus was alive. I knew it. Because a man like him did not die so easily. In a simple explosion, I felt the vibration of a phone in my pocket, a device I had stolen from the guard on the free boat before I jumped. It was a message from a blocked number containing a single photo of Leo standing in a garden in Lucerne. He was holding a red balloon, and behind him was the silhouette of Marcus Sterling, his hand resting on my Tina's brother's small and innocent shoulder. The war was no longer about money or power or the death of my father, but about the heart. I had tried to hide from the world. I began to type, my voice a whisper in the dark cafe, promising that I would find them both and I would end this game once and for all. The lights of the cafe flickered as my virus began to eat through the power grid of the city of Zurich, one block at a time. I was the Fuanghuang, and I was bringing the fire to the mountains of the rich and the cold-hearted men who ruled the world from the shadows of the Alps. I walked out into the snow, the cold no longer a threat, but a friend that would hide my path toward my final and most bloody revenge. I am back in New York, standing in the gray shadows of Rikers Island, to bargain with the man I sent to hell. Julian is the only person who can help me destroy Marcus, and I am willing to trade his life for my brother's safety. The final war has officially begun. I walked through the iron gates of the detention center, the smell of bleach and old sweat hitting my lungs like a physical blow. I used a forged federal badge and a fake court in order to bypass the midnight security check-in, the visitor's block. Julian was sitting behind the glass, his orange jumpsuit, a cheap imitation of the power he once held in Manhattan. He looked like a hollowed out, a shell of a man, his skin pale and his eyes sunken into his skull from the lack of sunlight. I sat down on the cold metal stool, and I did not say a word for one long minute. I watched him, watching me, his hands trembling with a mix of hatred and the desperate hope for survival. He reached for the phone, and his voice was a dry rattle as he asked me if I had come to watch him die. I did not blink. I only leaned in, closer to the glass, and I told him that we were both puppets of the same master, Marcus Sterling. Julian's fingers gripped the plastic receiver so hard that his knuckles began to turn a ghostly white against the grime. He laughed, a jagged and broken sound, and he told me that I was delusional to think his own lawyer would ever betray the hand that fed him millions. I did not argue. I simply held up the tablet and played the recording of Marcus and Henderson discussing the liquidation of the Vance family name in Zurich. I showed him the Documents proving that Marcus had been the one to sabotage the brakes of my father's car 3 years ago. The silence between us became a thick and suffocating wall as Julian realized that he had been a pawn in a game he thought he was winning. He looked at the silver ring I was still wearing, and he realized that the council had never intended for him to survive his time in prison. He spat on the floor, his rage a physical heat that I could feel through the reinforced glass of the interrogation room now. He told me that he knew where the Raider Council kept the physical gold reserves, the 400 tons of bullion that backed their digital energy credits in Europe. He said he would give me the coordinates, but only if I signed a petition for his immediate release and gave him the ring. I leaned back, a cold smile touching my lips for the first time in 48 hours of this hellish journey. I told Julian that his freedom was a currency that had no value in the world I was currently building. I did not need him alive. I only needed the information that AD was locked inside his pathetic and dying brain. I told him that Marcus was currently in Switzerland, holding our brother, Leo, as a human shield against the ledger. I said that if he gave me the location of the gold, I would ensure that Isabella Thorne was given a lethal dose of her own medicine tonight. This was the psychological anchor he needed, the chance to punish the doc, a woman who had betrayed him with the hitman. Julian's eyes lit up with a dark and predatory glint, the same evil that had once made me fall in love with him. He leaned in and whispered the name of a private vault beneath the Swiss National Bank, a place called the Iron Rose Cellar. He gave me the biometric passcodes that were hidden in the serial, a number of his father's vintage watch, currently sitting in the evidence locker. I realized that the game was no longer about a $500 million inheritance, but about the survival of the Vance soul. I stood up, and I called the guard to end the session, but I stopped at the heavy steel door for one last parting shot. I told Julian that I had already contacted the warden and informed to him of a hidden stash of drugs in his cell block. By the time he woke up tomorrow morning, he would be in solitary confinement, far away from any lawyer or any hope of release. He roared in fury, slamming his fists against the glass until a red smear of blood marked the spot where my face had been. I did not look back. I walked out into the cold night of New York City, and I felt the silver ring vibrating in my pocket again. Marcus was calling me, but I did not answer the phone. I simply sent a text with the coordinates of the Iron Rose Vault. I wanted him to know that I was coming for him, and that his golden fortress was about to become a furnace of fire. I headed for the private airfield, where a blacked out jet was, waiting to take me back to the mountains. I had the codes, I had the rage, and I had the truth about my father. The final move on, the Swiss chessboard was now in my hands, and I was ready to strike the king. Just as I reached the runway, a black van swerved in front of my sedan, blocking the path to the hangar with a scream. 4 men in tactical gear jumped out, their weapons aimed at my windshield with a deadly and silent intent now. I did not brake. I shifted into reverse, and I slammed my foot onto the gas, spinning the car in a wide and dangerous arc. I grabbed the small explosive device I had taken from the Hampton cellar and I tossed it out the window toward their engine. A roar of white fire consumed the front of the van, sending a wave of heat through my open door. I did not wait for the smoke to clear. I drove through the grass and toward the open ramp of the waiting jet engine. Marcus's voice came over the car's speakers. He was laughing, telling me that the Iron Rose was a trap designed to lure me back to his territory. He said that Leo was already on a plane to a private island in the South Pacific where I never find him again. I felt the jet begin to move, the G-force pulling at my body as we lifted into the dark and rainy sky above. I looked at the screen, and I saw a new signal appearing from the microchip in my father's old journal. It was a GPS tracker, and it was moving toward the same island Marcus had mentioned. My father had planned for this 30 years ago, and the final trap was not mine. I sat in the cabin of the jet, the air thin and tasting of high altitude, ozone and expensive leather. I opened the journal once more, tracing the ink of my father's last entries with a cold and steady finger now. He had known that the council would one day come for the gold, and he had hidden a secondary key inside a locket that Leo always wore around his neck. This was why Marcus had taken him, not just as a shield, but as a final lock to the Iron Rose treasure vault. I realized that my entire life had been a series of moves on a board I did not fully understand until this very moment. I pulled up the satellite feed of the coordinates in the South Pacific, and I saw a small dot of green in the middle of the deep blue, empty ocean. It was a volcanic island owned by a shell company that Marcus had bought 10 years ago with the Vance family's stolen money. I told the pilot to change course and to push the engines to their maximum speed, regardless of the fuel. I had exactly 12 hours to reach the island before Marcus could force Leo to open the final vault door. I looked out at the stars, and I felt a sense of peace I had not known since the day I went to prison. The hunter was now the hunted, and I was bringing the fire of the Vance name to his secret paradise. The jet shook with a sudden turbulence as we entered the storm, front moving over the brass equator toward the island. I saw a flash of lightning illuminating the purposes, dark clouds, like a jagged crack in the round ceiling of the world. I grabbed my tactical gear and I began to check the weapons I had hidden in the floorboards of the private jet's cargo hold. I had a rifle, a pair of combat knives, and enough high-yield explosives to level a small city. I was no longer a wife or a sister or a victim. I was a weapon, forged in the fires of betrayal and time. I felt the descent begin, the pressure in my ears increasing as the pilot announced that we were 5 miles from the drop zone. I was not going to land on the runway. I was going to jump into the dark water and swim to the shore in the middle of the tropical storm. Marcus would be watching the sky for a plane, but I would not see the shadow moving through the waves under the moonlight. I stepped to the door, the wind screaming into the cabin, and I jumped into the 24 void without a single second of doubt or fear in my heart. The water was warm, and the rain was a physical weight on my shoulders as I kicked toward the black sand beach of the Ute volcanic island. I could see the lights of a massive villa perched on the edge of the crater, shining like a demon's eyes in the reckless, dark night. I pulled myself onto the shore, the sand gritty and hot under my boots, and I moved into the thick jungle canopy immediately. I could hear the sound of patrols moving through the undergrowth. There, flashlights cutting through a mist like long and hungry fingers. I did not use my weapon. I moved like a ghost through the trees, using the shadows to hide my path toward the villa's main security gate. I reached the fence, and I used a small electronic jammer to disable the motion sensors. For exactly 60 seconds, I climbed over the provided wire, my hands bleeding from the sharp edges, but I did not feel the pain at all. I was focused on the heat signature of my brother, which was now appearing on my watch, directly in the center of the villa. Marcus was there. I could hear his voice over the garden speakers, mocking me for my slow and predictable moves. He did not know that I was standing exactly 10 feet behind his head of security, with a knife in my hand. I took the man down silently, his body falling into the hibiscus bushes with a soft and muffled thud now. I took his radio and his keycard, and I moved toward the glass doors of the master bedroom suite. I could see Marcus, standing by the bed, holding Leo's hand and pointing toward the mountains on the horizon line. He was telling my brother a story about a kingdom made of gold, and how they would soon be the kings of the entire world together. I felt a surge of pure and unadulterated hatred, a fire that threatened to consume my turd, very soul and mind. I stepped through the door, the sound of the sliding glass, a sharp crack in the silence of the room. Marcus turned around, his eyes wide with a shock of my presence, and he reached for the gun on the nightstand with a hiss. I was faster. I fired a single round from my suppressed pistol, hitting the weapon and sending it flying across the polished marble floor. Leo screamed and ran to me, his small arms wrapping around my waist with a force that nearly knocked me over with relief. I looked at Marcus, and I told him that the story was over and the king was about to be executed by the queen. Marcus laughed, a cold and hollow sound that echoed through the large and empty bedroom suite. He told me that the island was wired with enough C4 to blow the entire volcano into the atmosphere. If I killed him, we would all die, and the ledger would be lost to the ocean for another 1,000 years of human history. I looked at the remote in his hand, and I realized that he was not lying. He was the kind of man who would rather destroy everything than lose a single game. I told Leo to go into the bathroom and to lock the door and not to come out until I called his name twice. I turned back to Marcus, and I dropped my weapon on the fracked floor, showing him my empty and open hands. I told him that I was not here for the gold or the ledger. I was here for the life of the man who killed my father and stole my 3 years. He stepped toward me, his face a mask of arrogance and triumph, and he raised his hand to strike me. I did not flinch. I only waited for the moment his skin touched mine to activate the final trap I had prepared in Zurich. The silver ring was not a key. It was a contact transmitter for a neurotoxin that I had coated on my own skin tonight. Marcus froze, his muscles locking as the poison began to paralyze his nervous system in seconds. He fell to his providence knees, his eyes wide, with the realization that he had been tricked by the very woman he thought he owned. I stood over him, my voice a whisper, as I told him that my father had designed the toxin for the council's own cleaners. I reached into his pocket and took the remote, and I disabled the explosive charges with a single code from the Black Ledger's files. I looked at him, and I told him that I was going to leave him here, on this island, with the volcano and the silence of his greed. I grabbed Leo and we headed for the one private dock where a fast boat was waiting for our final escape. Behind us, the villa began to glow with the first signs of a fire. I had started in the server room before I entered. Marcus Sterling was still alive, but he was a prisoner in his own paradise, a man without a voice and without a single friend. We sped away from the island, the lights of the fire reflecting on the water like 1,000 golden coins. I looked at Leo, and I knew that the Vance name was finally free from the dyed shadows of the past. The black hulls of the Council's fleet rose like shark fins from the dark Pacific, cutting off my only path to freedom. I stood on the deck with the final half of the black ledger in my hands, ready to trigger a global financial collapse if they fired a perfider. Single shot at us, the speedboat roared, engines screaming against the 25 high salt spray. As I pushed toward the open sea near the equator, I saw them, 4 massive destroyers, their hulls unmarked and black, moving in a pincer formation to block the horizon of the night sky. Marcus was a lie, but the suitcase I found under the seat was the truth. I had been hunting for 3 long years. I clicked the latches open, the metallic snap echoing over the roar of the wind and the waves. Inside lay the missing drives, the other half of the black ledger, along with a handwritten file that stopped my heart and my breath. Marcus Sterling was never the king. He was just a debt collector for a man known only as the architect. This shadow figure had orchestrated my father's death, using Marcus as a convenient tool to keep his own hands clean. I looked at Leo, who was sleeping against a pile of life vests, unaware that his sister was about to declare war on the world's secret masters. I pulled out the satellite uplink, my fingers moving with the precision of a skilled surgeon, as I prepared the final virus for deployment. The radio crackled, a distorted voice, filled with the arrogance of a man who owned the sky and the sea. Henderson spoke, his words a death sentence, telling me to stop the engines or be vaporized by their heat-seeking missiles now. I did not slow down. I steered the quartermint boat directly toward the largest ship, challenging their resolve to destroy the data I held in my hands. I told Henderson, over the open channel, that I had found the architect's personal file and the master encryption keys. Every dollar the council owned, every secret account in Switzerland, was now linked to my pulse and my finger. If they killed me, the global energy market would collapse into a black hole of worthless data and frozen assets. I saw the missile bay doors opening on the lead destroyer, the mechanical hum vibrating through the water, and my very soul My father had died. For this information, and I was willing to burn the entire world, to avenge his ghost and his name. The pincer closed, the black ships towering over my small boat, like ancient and angry gods of the deep. Atlantic Ocean today. I held the drive, high in the air, letting their cameras see the weapon that would end their reign of terror and greed forever. $100 billion was the price of my life, and I was ready to spend every cent to win. I opened the architect's file, and I saw a photo taken 30 years ago at a Vance family dinner in downtown New York. The man standing next to my father was not a politician or a CEO. He was the judge who had sentenced me to prison. Justice Miller, the man who preached about law and order while he signed the orders for my father's liquidation. The betrayal was a living thing, a cold and hungry snake that had been eating my life for over a decade of lies. I realized that the entire legal system was just a playground for the Council of 12 to hide their sins. I looked at the destroyer, and I signaled for them to board. To me, knowing that the architect was watching through their high-definition cameras. This was the logic of the trap. I had to let them think they were winning, to get close enough to strike. I held up the drive, the moonlight reflecting off the silver casing like a beacon of absolute and final destruction. Henderson's voice returned, telling me that the council was willing to trade Leo's safety for the complete and total erasure of the architect's identity and his crimes. I laughed into the microphone, telling him that justice was not for sale at any price, especially not his. I connected the black ledger to the global satellite, and I initiated the general mobilization protocol I had built in Zurich. $100 billion in digital currency began to migrate through a way 1,000 shell companies toward a public charity fund. I showed the live transfer screen to the cameras of the boarding team as they climbed onto my small deck. The soldiers froze, their weapons aimed at my head, but their eyes were fixed on the screen of my tablet in the dark. I told them that for every step they took toward me, $10 million would disappear from their employers' private retirement accounts. This was the dopamine of the hunt, watching the hunters become the hunted by their own greed and human fear. Henderson roared through the comms, ordering them to fire, but no man moved a finger against the source of his wealth and future. I was no longer a victim. I was the virus infecting the Respash, a heart of the global, a financial machine from a boat. The board of directors in London and Dubai were watching their net worth evaporate in real time before their very eyes tonight. I watched the numbers tick down. Each million. A strike against the men who had stolen my youth and family. The sky above us began to hum with the sound of a secondary fleet of drones arriving from the mainland. They were not council drones. They belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, led by Marcus, Sterling's own former partner. I had sent the location to the authorities as a failsafe, but I did not trust the men in badges any more than the men in suits. I saw the architect appear on the main screen of the council's lead ship, his face a mask of old and withered power now. He told me that I was a talented player, but that the game was always rigged in favor of the house. I told him that I had just changed the locks on the house, and I was about to set the entire structure on a path of fire. I executed the freeze command, locking every council asset in a digital vault that only my father's biometric signature could ever open. Since he was dead, the council was now officially bankrupt, and their private army was now working for a ghost of the past. The soldiers on my deck lowered their rifles, realizing that their paychecks had just turned into worthless lines of code. The architect's face twisted in a silent scream of rage as his empire turned into dust and digital ash. I turned to the lead soldier, and I told him that he was now a free man with a clean slate in New York. I offered him a job as Leo's personal guard for a price that the council could never dream of matching. He nodded, a silent and heavy agreement, and he turned his weapon toward the council's own command ship. I looked at the architect, and I told Tim that I was coming to Manhattan to personally serve him his final notice of eviction. The pincer formation broke, the black destroyers drifting aimlessly as their command. Systems were consumed by my virus. I looked at Leo, who was finally waking up, and I told him that the world was a different place than the one we left yesterday morning. We headed for the coastline, the rising sun painting the water in shades of gold and fire for a new beginning. I checked the suitcase one last time, and I saw a small, hidden compartment that I had missed before. Inside was a photo of my mother, and she was holding a baby that was not me or Leo. A sudden transmission from Rikers Island appeared on my phone with Julian, Vance's frantic and dying voice screaming for help. He told me that Isabella was not dead, and she was coming for the baby in the photo tonight. I stepped onto the cold marble of Judge Miller's private estate in Westchester, New York. My mercenary team moved like shadows, neutralizing the perimeter guards without a single audible breath. The architect was inside, celebrating a victory he had not yet won. over my family's broken remains. I gripped my father's journal, the microchip inside humming with the power to dismantle the entire judicial system of the state. I found the hidden nursery, a room filled with sunlight and the smell of lavender and expensive formula. A small boy, no more than 2 years old, sat in a crib, his eyes reflecting the same deep blue as my father's own. I realized then that the photo was not a threat, but a map to the secret legacy my father had tried to protect from the council's greed. Julian's warning from Rikers Island echoed in my mind, telling me that Isabella was already on and her way to finish the job. I picked up the child, his small weight, a heavy responsibility, against my chest as I moved deeper into the house. I could hear the sound of voices in the main study, where the man who had ordered my father's death was, pouring a glass of celebratory cognac. He did not know that the Phoenix was standing at his door, with a ledger full of fire and a heart full of cold and calculated vengeance tonight. I opened the safe hidden behind the painting of Justice in Miller's private study, using the biometric codes I had forced from Julian. Inside lay the original birth certificate of Theo Vance, the boy in my arms, and the son of Thomas Vance and a high-ranking woman of the Council of 12. My father had not been killed for oil contracts alone. He had been liquidated to prevent an heir from uniting the council's fractured energy shares. I felt a cold, jagged wave of grief, knowing my father had carried this secret alone for years until they cornered him on that bridge. Miller's voice boomed from the doorway, a low and predatory sound that carried the weight of Nain. 40 years of unchecked legal authority and absolute corruption. He told me that I was a nuisance that had lived far too long, and that the child was the final piece of property he needed to secure his throne. I did not flinch. I simply shifted Theo to my left arm and drew the suppressed pistol, with my right hand in one fluid, mechanical motion. I told Miller that his gavel would never fall again, and that the only sentence he would hear tonight was the sound of his own world collapsing into a pile of digital ash and federal indictments. Isabella Thorne stepped into the room, her face a mask of beautiful madness, and her hand gripping a chrome-plated .45 caliber handgun. She ignored Miller, her eyes fixed on me with a hatred that had been festering for 3 long years in the shadows of my marriage. She called me a gold digger who had stolen her life and her future, even as she prepared to kill the only family I had left. I realized that Marcus had been her lover as well as her accomplice, a web of betrayal that went deeper than I had ever imagined during my time in the cell at Bedford Hills. Miller laughed, a dry and hollow sound, and he told Isabella to finish it before the authorities arrived at the gates. I activated the Russian secondary broadcast on my tablet, linking the mansion's internal security cameras to the live feed of the Department of Justice's main server. Every word they spoke was being recorded and analyzed by a dozen federal agents who were currently circling the estate in blacked-out suburban vehicles. Isabella screamed, a primal sound of frustration, and she aimed the weapon at Theo's head with a trembling and desperate finger on the cold trigger. I moved between them, my body a shield of flesh and bone against the coming fire. The sound of the first breaching charge echoed through the halls, a roar of white noise and dust that filled the library. Isabella fired, but the bullet hit the mahogany desk. As I tackled her to the floor, my hands finding her throat with a strength born of 3 years of prison yard survival. We struggled, in the dirt and the debris, 2 women fighting, for the soul of a legacy that had already been destroyed by the men in suits. I did not use the gun. I used the weight of my own body to pin her down, my eyes fixed on her until she saw the true predator I had become. I told her that she was nothing but a tool for Miller, a disposable asset that was about to be liquidated by the very council she worshipped with such blind devotion. Miller tried to run for the hidden elevator, but Marcus Sterling appeared in the doorway, his face covered in bandages from the island fire. He looked at the judge and then at me, his weapon held at his side in a gesture of absolute and final defeat. He said that the architect had betrayed him first, and that he was here to ensure that nobody left this house alive tonight. I saw the grenade in his hand, the pin already pulled and his thumb holding the lever with a deathly and silent grip. I grabbed Theo and dove behind the reinforced a safe door just as Marcus released the lever, and the world turned into a furnace of fire. The library exploded, the shockwave shattering the remaining windows and sending Miller's secret files into the air like burning white birds. I felt the heat, a physical wall of pain against my prove-it back, but I did not let go of the boy. When the smoke cleared, Isabella was gone, buried under the debris of the ceiling, and Marcus lay near the elevator, his eyes open and vacant of any life or greed. Miller was screaming, his legs pinned under the fallen mahogany table, his power reduced to a series of pathetic and high-pitched whines. I walked over to him, the silver ring on my finger glowing in the light of the fires consuming his mansion. I told him that the Black Ledger was now public, and that his name was the first on the phonery, a list of every major news outlet in the country. Federal agents swarmed the room, their weapons drawn as they took control of the architect and his broken kingdom. I handed Theo to the lead agent, a woman with a face that looked like she understood the price of justice. I walked out of the house, the night air of Westchester cool against my skin. I stood on the lawn, watching the flashing lights of the ambulances and the police cars, reflecting on the surface of the private lake. Leo was waiting in a car at the Fiste end of the driveway, his face pressed against the glass as he searched for his sister. I realized that the Vance name did not belong to Julian or Miller or the council. It belonged to the boy in the house, and the girl who had survived the dark. The $500 million was now in my control, a weapon I would use to rebuild the city my father had loved. Julian would die in prison, a man forgotten by the world he tried to own with such cruelty and greed. I looked up at the stars, the same stars I had watched from my cell window for 1,095 nights of my life. The phoenix had finally taken flight, and the ash was all that remained of the snakes who had tried to clip my wings. I walked toward Leo, my heart finally at peace, and I knew that the war was over. The game was won. The debt was paid, and the Vance legacy was finally free from the shadows. I was no longer a prisoner or a victim. I was Elena Vance, the woman who had burned down a throne to save $1. Soul. The end of the story was only the beginning of my new life in Newark, York City today. I took the first step toward the car, and I did not look back at the ruin of the house or the legacy of hate my father would have been proud of, the fire I had built, and the family I had rescued from the cold. The city was waiting for the light, and I was the one who held the flame in my steady hands now. I am standing on the helipad of the Vance Legacy Tower, watching the sunrise over Manhattan, while the world below me finally begins to breathe. The silver ring is now a silent relic on my desk, its poison drained, and its digital secrets exposed to the federal authorities. Leo is downstairs in the private medical suite, his new heart beating with a steady and rhythmic strength for the first time in 10 years. I am no longer a prisoner of the past. I am the architect of a new future for the Vance name, and the guardian of its true survivors. The air is cool, and the city is a grid of gold and shadow, moving to a heartbeat that I helped restore through fire and blood. I look at the legal documents in my hand, the final signatures that consolidate my control over $3.5 billion in assets and energy shares. This was the prize I fought for. The prize that cost me 3 years of my youth and the life of my father. I am not a victim of the system. I am the woman who dismantled it from the inside out. And I am just getting started. The news cycles are still burning with the fallout. From the release of the Black Ledger, across every major network in the country. Judge Miller is facing life in a federal facility, and Julian Vance is a ghost in a cell at Rikers Island, waiting for a final judgment. I visited Julian yesterday, not to gloat over his misery, but to serve him the final divorce papers and the notice of his total bankruptcy. He did not speak. He only stared at the gray floor, a man who had lost his voice along with his stolen empire. Isabella Thorne is gone. Her name, a footnote in a tragedy she helped write with her own vanity and greed. I left Julian in the silence of his own making, and I walked out into the sunlight of a world that no longer fears his name. The legal war is over, and the reconstruction of the Vance legacy has begun with a team of lawyers who actually respect the law. Every politician and judge in the ledger is being investigated, their careers ending in a series of public executions of their character and status. Theo is sleeping in the nursery on the top floor, his legal adoption papers signed and sealed by the highest court in the state of New York. He is my brother, the secret son of the man they murdered, and I will be the shield that protects him from the council. I opened the $500 million trust fund today, and I directed every cent toward the construction of the Thomas Vance Memorial Hospital. This is not for profit. It is for the people Julian tried to crush under the weight of his father's corporate greed and oil. I am the daughter of a man who believed in justice, and I will spend the rest of my life proving him right. Leo walked to the window this morning, his skin no longer pale, his eyes bright with the hope of a life outside of a hospital ward. He asked me if we were finally home, and I told him that home is anywhere the snakes cannot reach us. We are the survivors of a storm that tried to drown us, and we are standing on the shore of a new and beautiful era. The media calls me the Phoenix of Wall Street, a woman who rose from a prison cell to dismantle a corrupt and global energy empire. I do not care for the titles. I only care for the silence in my mind when I think of my father's final journal entry. I spent the afternoon at the cemetery in Westchester, placing a single white lily on his grave and telling him that the war was finally won. The men who took his life are either dead or in cages, and the truth of his sacrifice is now a matter of public record. The shadows of the Hamptons estate are gone, replaced by the clean lines of a foundation dedicated to clearing the names of the wrongly accused. I am a woman of my word, and I have paid my debts to everyone who helped me survive the long and cold nights. The city looks different tonight, the lights of New York shining with a clarity and a brilliance I have never seen before in my life. I am no longer a girl searching for a place at the table. I am the one who owns the room. Marcus Sterling's sacrifice was a debt I did not want him to pay. But I know it was his only path to true and final redemption. I renamed the corporate legal department in his honor. A reminder to everyone that even the most broken man can find the truth in the end. The architect is behind bars, and the Council of 12 is a scattered group of cowards fleeing from the reach of the federal prosecutors. I have the Viro microchip from my father's journal, and I will use it to ensure that the energy grid remains a public good forever. The city is a sea of possibilities, and I am the tide that is coming to wash away the last remnants of the old guard. I look down at the streets where I once walked in rags after my release, and I feel a sense of peace that is absolute. The rain has stopped, the clouds have parted, and the air is fresh with the scent of a new beginning for us all. I am the sister of a hero, the mother of a legacy, and the woman who won the game of shadows. I walk to the edge of the helipad, the wind tugging at my black silk dress, and I look out at the horizon line. My father's journal is locked in the master safe, its pages a guide for the long and difficult journey that lies ahead of us. I am Elena Vance, and I am finally, and completely, free from the chains of the past and the lies of the rich. The story of my revenge is finished, but the story of my life is just beginning to unfold under the New York sun. I turn away from the view, and I walk back inside to the two boys who are waiting for their sister to come home. I smile, a real and genuine smile, as I close the heavy glass doors on the world I have finally reclaimed. The Vance legacy is no longer a story of blood. It is a story of light and the fire that never goes out. My father is at rest. My brother is alive, and the city is mine to build. The end is just the start of everything.